Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, on the land stolen from the Chichimeca, Otomi, and Noaha peoples. With the pandemic, we have had to discontinue our in-person programs and instituted these webinars. Without our usual revenue-generating programs, however, we have depended upon your donations to support the center and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program is a very special occasion for us. We are marking Indigenous Peoples Day, what used to be widely known as Columbus Day. At least since 1937, it has been an official national holiday honoring Christopher Columbus. But today, this year, for the first time, it has now been proclaimed by President Biden as Indigenous Peoples Day. He issued two proclamations, a proclamation for Columbus Day and a proclamation for Indigenous Peoples Day. We're honored to have as our speaker today, Roseanne Dunbar Ortiz, who was on Democracy Now! Just this morning, speaking about the contradiction between Indigenous Peoples Day and Columbus Day. It is kind of a hybrid today, marking perhaps a transition away from the traditional celebration of Christopher Columbus to the more appropriate recognition of the indigenous people on whose continent the United States was founded. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz is a historian, writer, professor emeritus at California State University, and longtime social justice activist. She's the author of 15 books, among which is the Not a Nation of Immigrants, which is her most recent publication, and will be the focus of our discussion today. The subtitle tells it all: Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. She has also written the widely acclaimed Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, a 2014 book that won the American Book Award. She's also authored Unloaded, Disarming History of the Second Amendment, and Roots of Resistance, A History of Land Tenure in New Mexico. We're very fortunate to have her with us today. She has a very busy schedule. This is one of several uh, Zoom discussions she's given besides Democracy Now! She has others coming up, and we certainly value the time with her. She will be giving a presentation focusing on settler colonialism, and there will be time then for some Q&A. So let's get right on to listening to Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Welcome.
Thank you, Cliff. And I want to thank the Center for Global Justice and Cliff Duran for hosting my talk today. Well, yeah, this federal holiday celebrates the 529th anniversary of the landing of Columbus on one of the islands of the Bahamas, what is now called the Bahamas. Columbus represents and symbolizes the onset of Christian Europe's bloody colonization of the non-European world, not only the Western Hemisphere. It also marks the onset of the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans to the Western Hemisphere, as well as the enslavement of indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere. It thereby celebrates conquest and genocide. It's a very inappropriate holiday. And it's of course completely contradictory to have both. They're in contradiction with each other. One is mourning, the mourning of indigenous peoples of the Americas, and the other is a celebration of genocide. So, and an embrace of colonialism, which I think most people in the United States still do. And no country, not even Spain, that commissioned Columbus' voyage, celebrates Columbus as robustly as does the United States, which dates back to the founding of the United States, naming the location of the US Capitol, the District of Columbia. Columbia is a Latin word that means the land of Columbus. Well, since the establishment of the federal holiday in 1934 by the Franklin Roosevelt administration, indigenous peoples have opposed it, joined in the 1960s onward with many allies to rename the day and make it a day of mourning for the indigenous peoples of the Americas and a celebration of survival. A growing number of states, cities, organizations, and universities celebrate the day as Indigenous Peoples' Day, which we are doing here today. So although celebration of Columbus claims to be a celebration of immigration, namely of Italian immigrants, it promotes the conceit of the US as a nation of immigrants. Liberal and even many left US intellectuals, politicians, and activists, as well as the rest of the world, view the United States as a nation of immigrants. In doing so, they automatically hide the fact of settler colonialism. The difference between an immigrant and a settler is important. Immigrants join existing political, economic, and social orders, but settlers create new ones. If Europeans who created the United States had been immigrants, they would have joined the existing indigenous nations and communities. Instead, they violently destroyed those societies, forcibly removing the residents who survived and built a totally new political order that was reinforced by later waves of settlement as the US expanded across the continent. So the United States was founded as the first settler colonial state. Britain was a settler colonial empire. It did settler colonialism in Ireland. and Spain in ethnically cleansing the Iberian Peninsula of Muslims and Jews, and moving in the northern Spanish people to simply take over everything that they had developed. That too was settler colonialism, but neither were states as such, republics. So the United States was founded as the first settler colonial state, republic. This conflation of immigrant and settler is essential to the US settler colonial state in order to obscure the nation state created by settler colonialism. What is being obscured is a history of genocide, ethnic cleansing, official racism, and concentration camps, which the Nazis borrowed in the 20th century and was copied in the founding of the settler states of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina in the 19th century, and Israel and apartheid South Africa in 1948. In the founding and formation of the United States, settler colonialism was more than a British colonial practice and structure in the North American colonies that developed and replicated itself over time in the 170 years of British colonization in North America, which preceded the founding of the United States. The founders were not an oppressed, colonized people. They were British citizens being restrained by the monarch from expanding the 13 colonies to enrich themselves and also to expand plantation slavery. They were imperialists who visualized the conquest of the continent and gaining access to the Pacific and China. Achieving that goal required land, wealth, and settler participation. The founders devised a unique plan manifest in the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which was created during the War of Independence by the Continental Congress and reenacted at independence by the US Congress in 1789. Designed as what historian Howard Lamar called an internal colonial system for the West, its provisions were borrowed in part from the British system of settler colonialism in Ulster and the 13 North American colonies. However, this invention of the United States was something new. The constitutional construction of the fiscal military settler state with ethnic cleansing of Native nations presence. The fiscal military state is a capitalist state made for war. So the Northwest Ordinance provided for eventual settler self-government once European American settlers outnumbered the indigenous population. This Land Act guaranteed to the settlers land, civil rights, religious freedom, trial by jury, representational legislation, and public education. That's what was done to attract Western European and British settlers, as well as entice people to move from the crowded Northeast into these newly conquered areas. The ultimate conclusion, however, was preceded by successive stages of colonial development, from the US Army ethnic cleansing, of war against the people the residents, and control to that would go then from when they had reduced the native population, a federally appointed territorial government, and then a semi-representational government to finally admission into the United States as a state. It could take quite a long time. For instance, New Mexico, which I've studied in depth, was conquered with the taking of half of Mexico in 1848. but it did not become a state until 1913. Quite a long process of territorial control from the federal government. So this really constituted a units of a fiscal military nation state, the states that got established. So the founders were unapologetic imperialists. They were British after all. They were British imperialists, but with the added conceit of an empire for liberty, as Thomas Jefferson conceived the future. Historian David Reynolds writes that Jefferson believed the US empire was destined to assume the responsibility to spread freedom around the world, starting with the North American continent and intervening abroad. So we know what freedom means in the United States. US foreign policy was stamped with this concept and has provided the ideological motivation for all US wars and interventions. Through the Northwest Ordinance, the United States created a unique land system among colonial powers, including Britain. In the US system, land itself, not just what was produced from the land, such as agriculture, mining, logging, grazing, and so on, but land itself, real estate, was the most important exchange commodity for the accumulation of capital and building the national treasury. In order to comprehend the apparently irrational genocidal policy of the US government toward the presence of native nations and communities on the land, this centrality of land sales in the building of the economic base of the US capitalist system must be the frame of reference. This policy was embedded in the design of the fiscal military state. Real estate, interestingly enough, remains the linchpin of the US economy. In 2008, a depression ensued with the collapse of the real estate market, and much government money was spent, our money, in patching it up. So, as anthropologist Patrick Wolf summed up the issue, tribal land was tribally owned. Tribes and private property do not mix. He calls Indians were the original communist menace. Whatever settlers say, the primary motive for elimination was not race or religion or ethnicity or grade of civilization. Those are all made up afterwards. Rather, access to territory, to land. Property in land is the settler colonialism's specific, irreducible element. However, Wolf, an Australian, didn't quite understand the difference for the US founders between territory and land and the centrality of land as real estate. But he makes a correct point about the US American obsession with private property. Regarding the communal nature of Native societies, Senator Henry Dawes, arguing in the 1880s for allotment of collectively held Indigenous lands, said, "The defect of the reservation system is apparent. It is Henry George's system." Henry George was a 19th century socialist. "And under that, there is no enterprise to make your home any better than that of your neighbors. There is no selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization. Till this people will consent to give up their lands and divide among their citizens so that each can own the land he cultivates, they will not make much more progress." And of course, the Dawes Act did allot Native land, and in the process, 3/4 of Native land holdings were taken away and made into private property for white settlers. Although private property in land had long been a fact of life in Europe, it was demarcated by the contours of streams, rivers, tree lines, rock formations, and mountains, and was reserved for the economic and political elite. The United States, being founded as a settler colonial fiscal military state, created something new under the sun: the plat system of privatizing land into marketable units. The Northwest Ordinance spawned the public land survey system, a unique surveying method to plat, that is, divide land, transforming it into property for sale and settling. Plots of 160 acres with sections of 4 plots or 640 acres. As the US took more land with the Louisiana Purchase, the Oregon Territory, and half of Mexico, the government promised free land to Europeans and Euro-Americans and people living in the East for the purpose of recruiting and motivating settlers to squat on indigenous peoples' lands. With indigenous resistance to the squatters, the army would be dispatched. The pieces of paper or deeds representing units of land made up the commodity market that built the United States capitalist system and remains its central factor. The other main commodity until 1860 was human, the enslaved African body with its deed of sale, not counting the labor, the free labor, unpaid labor. The land ordinance was equal to that of the Constitution of 1787 and was embedded in it. It declared in practical terms how the land from the Appalachian Mountains up to the Mississippi River was to be conquered. This was to be done by surveyors' chains, each 22 yards in length. The measuring began at an arbitrary point in the Ohio Territory, and invisible lines were drawn on the land to form a grid of perfect rectangles marked by cairns, iron bars, and the occasional brass plate cemented onto a masonry base. This was all while Native people were still there in their communities, simply surveying and cutting up their land, and then of course bringing the army in to remove them. Each of the rectangles had its own map reference, and as the US Imperium expanded, the grid eventually reached the Pacific coast and stretched between Mexico and British North America. The lines on the land not only conquered natural topography, but also made possible the liberation of parcels of the land from the previous occupants and their efficient allocation to newcomers. So this was the implementation of settler colonialism and the fiscal military state. The state made for war in order to appropriate property. From the beginning of surveys in the newly claimed Northwest Territory to the Pacific Ocean, the lands claimed by the surveys were already populated with indigenous peoples, but the land was treated as terra nullius, unpopulated land. While the indigenous nations and communities, reduced in numbers by genocidal warfare that caused displacement, starvation, crowded refugee situations, and resultant infectious diseases, were forced onto army-guarded reservations and dependent on government rations. The indigenous peoples, the large native agricultural nations of the South, were forcibly relocated to west of the Mississippi and Indian Territory that became Oklahoma, where I grew up. The US Army, Marines, and Texas Rangers invaded Mexico in 1846. And after 2 years of scorched earth from the Rio Grande and Veracruz to the 2 months violent occupation of Mexico City, the Mexican government was forced to sign a treaty ceding the northern half of their country to the United States, completing the US reaching the Pacific and conquest of the continent. For the next half century, the US Army made war on the native nations within the annexed territory, as well as the plains. In 1898, the US headed out with warships to conquer the Pacific, with the same officers in charge as in the wars against the Plains people that culminated in the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre. So how will we decolonize the United States? The first requirement for decolonization to be possible is for US Americans, including new immigrants and children of immigrants, to acknowledge that they live not in the First Republic, rather the first settler colony, and are complicit in maintaining the colonial status of Native nations today. Thank you. I'm ready for questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Roxanne. Let me just say a word about how we will handle questions. Some people are on YouTube, and for you to get a question or comment to us, you have to send it in an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will pass it on then to Roxanne. Those of you who are with us in the Zoom room, of course, can present your questions directly. And since Roxanne has a limited amount of time, I ask that you be brief in your questions so that we can make the most use of this time. If you have a question, raise your hand. Don't use the chat box. It's much more effective. I have you on screen share. I can see everybody in the Zoom room. Just raise your hand and wave, and you can unmute yourself. Who would like to go first?
You are unmuted, I think. Yes. Yes.
Do I see David Steyer?
Yes, I think I'm on, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
There was only one little slight disagreement, and that is the United States as it is definitely not a country of voluntary immigrants, but it was characterized by a large influx of involuntary immigrants who were Africans who became slaves, and so does that seem consistent with your thesis?
You're absolutely right. I have a whole chapter on enslaved Africans that clearly they're not immigrants. Immigration does not begin until the 1880s as such. The Irish refugees who came were not immigrants. Everyone except the enslaved people and the Irish refugees were settlers, as I explained at first. The first immigration law was in 1882, and it was the exclusion of the Chinese, who at the same time were being recruited by the thousands to build the railroad and to work in the gold fields. But they had no rights, they had no citizenship. And then the next immigration law was the law of expanding that exclusion to all Asians, the entire continent of Asia, including the Middle East, Turkey, everywhere, the whole Pacific. And that really didn't affect immigration from Europe So the first big mass entry of immigrants as such, who had to go through immigration processes, were from southern Italy. There was no Italy yet, but from Sicily and from the Mediterranean area. Eastern Europeans, Jews fleeing pogroms, other Eastern Europeans, Catholic, usually economic deprivation. They came to work in the factories and the mines and the smelters, hard work. They, unlike the Irish who had English, I mean, it wasn't their native language, but they forced to speak English and spoke it very well. These new immigrants spoke different languages and did not speak English, and they suffered a lot for it. I would say most of them, in the readings I did, the research I've done, didn't come to stay. I think probably the people fleeing the political people, and that included some Germans who were fleeing repression because of their socialism. There was no Germany yet, but in the German-speaking areas. So that you're absolutely right. You know, they were unwilling, and most of those who came from southern Italy and Sicily did go back or came to make enough money to go back and buy a piece of land. They were tenant farmers, sharecroppers. They had no skills other than agriculture. And they wanted to be farmers. Most of them got stuck here, stuck in that thing of remittances and then bringing families over rather than but then they were excluded. In 1924, draconian immigration law that excluded, put very cap on numbers of people who could immigrate other than Western Europeans. And we saw the tragedy of that during the Holocaust, when Jews were trying desperately to find some safe haven, and the United States had this very low quota, and Cuba, small Cuba, took more refugees, Jewish refugees, than the United States. Mexico did many more. Mm-hmm. So that is a responsibility for many deaths. It was draconian. It changed with a Nation of Immigrants. John F. Kennedy invented the term in 1958, running as an Irish Catholic for president. There had never been a president that wasn't either Anglo-Saxon or Scots-Irish, descendant of settlers. And I think it was his way of trying to present immigration in the United States as welcoming immigrants. So he devised, while he was president, he devised a new immigration plan, and he wasn't there to sign it. He was assassinated, but in 1965 it went through, and it was the first that opened up a bit more to Latin America and to non-European world. But it's, as we know, at the border and during the Trump administration, one gift he gave us was reality, what was happening already at the border. That was, Obama actually deported many more in his first 4 years of presidency than Trump did. So immigration is still, based on the model being a European. So it puts, I really agree with you that there's no really responsible immigration policy. And as Viet Nguyen, in his book, Nothing Ever Dies, his nonfiction book, he's famous for The Sympathizer and the novels, but everyone should read that book because he calculates that probably about 80% at least of 20th century so-called immigrants are from countries that the United States either created those refugees by war, like Southeast Asia, or interventions that made them unlivable, like Central America in the 1980s, making that place unlivable by interventions, and should properly all be called refugees. So that war and militarism has to be a part of any discussion of immigration.
Okay, Victor Wallace has a question, and after that, Carl Davidson.
Hi, Roxanne. It's very good to see you. I appreciate you.
Hi, Victor.
Your work.
I didn't know you were there.
Yes.
Good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. I was interested by the fact that you mentioned that the fundamental drive of the settlers was for land, and all the other rationales for what they were doing with the native population were superficial. And I'm thinking of the debate that's currently taking place over the 1619 project, and how the 1619 project has made the category of race as the prime mover, as opposed to the economic drive of enslavement and enrichment and so on. And I wondered if you had any general comments about that whole debate as it's currently taking place.
Well, there are numerous debates about 1619, and I think what, coming from the point of view of indigenous peoples, what is left out of 1619 is 1607, and the first genocidal clearing of the land of Native people at Jamestown. So those two can't be separated, because plantation slavery was only possible by taking native land. So the bodies of Africans by 1840 constituted more an asset greater than all other financial assets combined in the United States. All the assets in banks, even in land and everything. So that clearing Native people from the land to allow slavery to be the basis of U.S. capitalism. So I think it's, I really admire the power of the 1619 project, and how it has brought all these discussions on different levels. But I really wish we could get away from racism per se as a color thing, to colonialism. Africans experienced settler colonialism. They experienced colonialism when they were hauled to the Western Hemisphere. They were ripped off their land, just like Native people were later. So it's a colonial framework that I think so so much more accurately explains the dilemma we're in than race as such. I mean, there's no doubt that anti-Black racism and discrimination is a defining element of US culture. It affected immigration because basically, you could see even with the Irish refugees suffering that within 20 years, they were using blackface and working as slave patrollers. So it's almost a requirement for immigrants to express their anti-Black racism, to be white, to be accepted as a true American citizen. So I better stop there because our time is almost up, but I think one more question.
Yeah, Carl Davidson.
Roxanne,
Hi, Carl.
I finished your book. It's terrific. It's part of my ongoing quest to answer the question who we are. Politics is largely about identity politics, and I think we have to recast or reframe our identity as U.S. Americans. And your book is invaluable. I liked your reference to the point at the beginning. I've been to it. It's a little monument 4 miles up down the river from where I live. It's where they started staking out the Northwest Territory. And I read the little plaque, and I took a few people to visit it. So I really get what you're saying. My people were among the first settlers here, so I'm one of their descendants, and I've studied the family history some. I'm looking at things now from the framework of, expropriation, taking of the land as step one, and then the seizing of bodies, number two, and enslavement, and three, exploitation. The working of all subaltern groups for profit as a constituents. And I really agree with the fact that your point that we have to decolonize our minds in order to really be able to see things. I wrote up a little summary history thing I was doing, and I was trying to do Jamestown, and I realized I couldn't do it with 1619. I had to do it, like you said, with 1605 and 1607. The three wars against Powhatan peoples, and then I could bring in the African slaves that came in 1619 in order to get the story right, from the point of view of the oppressed. But my question to you is, I need a little bit more than we have to decolonize our minds. What are some of the other things that we need to do in terms of self-determination?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carl. My father's family, Dunbars, are the Scots-Irish original settlers in Appalachia too. So we know it. Not many of us admit it, but it's important that we explain that to people, what a settler is, a descendant of a settler, as opposed to an immigrant. And we have easier lives, that's for sure, even when poor. So we have to do much more. I think it's very hard for people to act until they do get a handle on what it is. What is the problem? What's the problem with the United States? Why is it awash in guns? Like no other country in the world, not even close. Even countries that are at war don't have that many guns in civilian hands. 350 million guns for 320 million people. So what, to really confront those questions, then I think the mind can be open to demands, like for demands for reparation from Black people descended from slavery, not just because they're Black, but they're descended from slavery, and some kind of representation of reparations for that exploitation, as you say, and misery, but also for Native people to understand. It's certainly this pipeline, movement is and the environmental movement of Native people are most visible, and I think have quite a bit of mass support. But the central demand of Native people is a land back, because all of the land taken from Native people without treaties under US law, not, some morality tale, is illegitimate. So all of the federal lands that exist, and most of the state public lands, so-called public lands, all over the continent, were taken without treaty. And that means the United States can't sell it. States have made it so they can sell public property, but it could be challenged. But the federal government cannot sell it because they don't own it. They don't have the deed to the national parks. They don't have the deed to the national forests. These are the most sacred lands of Native peoples that were taken, among all the land. And so land back is the slogan of Native people today, land back. And that's what's meant by land back. Most of the land that's in private property and individual private property hands have some kind of treaty basis to them, except in New Mexico, where they can't quiet title on anything because it's so mixed up, and almost 3/4 of the land is in public land holding. So land back so that Native nations can rebuild real societies, functioning societies, with schools and universities and banks and transportation, hospitals, medical schools, what any functioning metropolis has. And that's a really central demand. But I think going straight to that without understanding that it's just welfare or something, give them land, that I think it's very hard. So I think that at certain points, Marx said, ideology becomes, almost materialistic. And the dialectical materialism, the ideology itself, is a barrier to figuring out, a strategy. The left has no strategy in this country to really change it fundamentally and permanently. And I think that's because they're using a European model, a Western European model of analysis. And if Marx taught anything at all, is that you have to know in detail every aspect of what the relationship are, economic, social relationships in a society, to have any idea of how you change it. So I think not knowing United States, not it's not just a matter of do-gooding to recognize or acknowledge. It's life or death, probably for the planet. No, we're in serious straits right now. So it's not a rapid thing, but we do see that things, I think those of us from the 60s who were active saw that people's minds can change very quickly. But it takes a mass movement for that to happen. And we saw that last summer with or in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter led movements, that it was amazing. I mean, rural Oklahoma, there were towns where they were having demonstrations against the police and the military machinery that they had, and all over the middle of the country. It doesn't last, but in that moment of massive uprisings, so much learning can go on. And I know it because I didn't come into the left with, a background that my brothers and sisters certainly didn't. I was a Southern Baptist in rural Oklahoma and believed it all. I wasn't a rebel at all. But it was in those mass movements, starting with the civil rights movement, in which I learned. It's a fast learning process. It's faster than reading books or getting a degree, and that's the same way I learned, so that I could write an Indigenous people's history of the United States, is just those massive American Indian movement gatherings and demonstrations in the 70s. The learning process is very fast. So we should have an incentive because of that, even if it seems hopeless, to always try to mobilize, and especially mobilize against the military. I actually think that's the most important thing, is to understand the United States has never had a day without war, and that it is so in the culture, embedded in the culture, like white supremacy is. I prefer the term white supremacy or white nationalism to racism, by the way, because I think it's just more accurate.
I agree.
What
Thanks.
is this term? What
Well,
she prefers to racism?
Which
thank you very much, Roxanne. I know that your time is short, and we do need
Yes.
to end this. But I especially appreciate your response to Carl's question of, how do we eradicate the settler colonial foundation of the U.S. beyond just the kind of reckoning with our history that is now going on. And I think you've pointed in some fruitful directions on that. And that was something that maybe your next book can be about, because I found that was the question that this book ended with, but did not really answer. So hopefully we will hear more from you on what a new United States that is not a fiscal military state might look like. Well, thank you so much for sharing this
Thank
time
you.
with us today. And
Thank you all.
Thank you, Roxanne. Very illuminating.
Thank
It was
you.
wonderful to hear you. I'm from the Bay Area, and I'm wondering, were you around like the 70s and 80s? Were you in the Bay Area ever?
Yeah, I've been here since 1960.
Okay.
But I was away from 1964 to 74. So I came back in 74.
Uh-huh. Yeah, your name is very familiar to me. Yeah.
okay. Well,
Well, thank you. Bye.
if anyone wants to stay around after we end to talk about some of these ideas, you're welcome to do so, but we have to say goodbye to Roxanne now with our great thanks. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Next week, we have another special program on the People's Food Summit. There's a 24-hour global event of presenting a people's orientation to questions of food and agriculture. We will have two speakers talking about that. Precious Fira, speaking from Zimbabwe, and Ercilia Sohoris, speaking from San Miguel de Allende. So hope to see you next Monday at 1 o'clock Central Time again. Now let me give thanks to our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamant, Olivia Canales, and myself. And now this is Cliff Duran signing off for today.
That's it.